Hi everyone, thanks for sticking with us. I know it's been a long 2 days, but really great 2 days. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak about my work. So my name's Jack and I'm a maker from Glasgow in Scotland, and I'm here today to talk to you about some work I've been making over the past year and a half. The working title of it's Hyperreal Estate, and it's an experiment in reclaiming land from the private back into the public by way of the virtual. And I'm interested in the indexical qualities of photography and photogrammetry in particular. I really want to thank Alison, because I was going to have to explain the technical aspects of photogrammetry, but Alison's done a great job for me, so thank you. The work kind of started with this object, and what it is it's a drop of crude oil from the North Sea encapsulated in a piece of acrylic. And this was made by the BP company and distributed to people who worked in petrol stations all over the world as a way of giving them a piece of ownership of their company. I think it's quite insulting, to be honest. I'm going to pass it round because I think it's important to hold it. I'll just show it to the camera. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the presuppositions that I have for the work. I'm not a theorist. There's theory here. I'm a practice-based practitioner, and I work through ideas by making things, and I work through responses to ideas by people using the work and people engaging with the work, and that's how I work. I'm going to talk to you about some of the historical context of my work, some of the technical procedures, and I really want to make it as accessible as possible. So hopefully my game's going to be released in 2024 to coincide with the US presidential elections, and that'll make sense soon. So I'm going to risk my own life from this anonymous internet user from 2017. I'm going to seriously dumb down Deleuze. So Deleuze says that the virtual is not opposed to the real, but opposed to the actual. And Hito Style goes further, and she says, the image doesn't represent reality. It's a fragment of the real world. It's a thing like any other. And those are two presuppositions that I've sort of held in my work, and they're open to be challenged. I'm not sure that is actually the case, that either of those statements is definitely true, but it's something to experiment with. So going back to 1983, and we saw the release of Computer Eyes from Digital Vision. It was a company set up by a guy called Dave Pratt, and it was the first commercially available system to allow people to take photographs and bring them into the digital realm. And it was released for the Apple II, the Commodore, and the Spectrum. And with it came this slew of computer games in which photographs became part of the graphical language. So people started using photographs in their graphical pipelines. This is a real cultural nosedive for this conference, by the way. This is a game called Journey, but it's historically significant, and it was the first mass-released game to feature photography in the virtual. And it's a licensed game based on the soft rock band from America, Journey. And all they've done is they've taken photographs of the band and then popped them onto these sprites, and they're in this kind of mad universe that's got nothing to do with soft rock or anything like that, but it's quite significant. I was going to do a bit about the inevitable slew of pornography games that came in the 80s along with this technology, but no. So flash forward to 1992, and this is around when I was a kid, and I had a Nintendo system and I was playing Street Fighter, and this game came out for PlayStation, produced by Midway, Mortal Kombat, and it was a really significant game. And Mortal Kombat used a photographic process in the production of its sprites, and it was also a hyper-violent game. You could rip people's spines out, there was a lot of blood, and it caused a moral panic, particularly in America. And there's a guy called Senator Joe Lieberman, and he brought it to the Senate, and there was a hearing about video game violence. Significantly, though, about that hearing, the three games they brought to the Senate to represent video game violence were these three games. There was Mortal Kombat, Lethal Enforcers, which was a light gun type game, if you're familiar with that. It was packaged with a sort of Colt revolver, and you would shoot at the screen, and Night Trap. All of these games feature photography in their graphical pipelines. And you've got to bear in mind that at this point, that wasn't industry standard at all. The majority of games weren't made with photography as part of their graphical pipeline. And it got me thinking, like, is it about the violence? Because other games were violent. You know, Street Fighter is an incredibly violent game. Or is it about the connection between the photographic and this sense of realism and the violence that thrust it so significantly into the political sphere? Moving forward again, we get to 2014. And computational power and graphical processing units in particular have reached a point where we can have really big, immersive, detailed, photorealistic environments. And that's what everyone was striving for. The video game industry really wanted photorealism and immersion. And the Polish development company, the Astronauts, they released the game The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. This was the first game to have photogrammetry as the main component of its graphical pipeline. So they were going out into the world and they were capturing buildings. So in this case, they would, just as Alison described, but they would be out in the real world, they'd be taking many photographs all around, probably flying drones over it, bringing it into a computer and producing a photorealistic environment. Another studio who picked it up were Dice LA. They're massive. They work on games like Battlefield, Star Wars Battlefronts, like big budget AAA games, like huge things. But what was significant for Dice LA wasn't necessarily this idea of specificity of place. It was about fidelity, it was about photorealism, and also about economy. So you can see when they were producing Battlefront, that's the average number of days it would take to produce an asset. So say a building or a bridge would be 14 days, and then they brought photogrammetry in for Star Wars Battlefront, and it reduced down to 4 days. Whereas the Astronauts, what they said about their game, they said their game was set in the Carcanoes Mountains. And it was about the specificity of place, that you were going to go and play this game in the Carcanoes Mountains. So as I said, GPU power has been getting more and more powerful. Mustafa Suleyman wrote in his recent book, The Coming Wave, that the demand for photorealistic games means that companies like NVIDIA invested so much into making better hardware. And that's significant in terms of AI, because it's the GPUs that are being used to train these models. And so we have a direct connection between photorealism and a desire for photorealism and the AI industry. So yeah, I got to a point where I decided to sell my camera and upgrade to a GPU, which was quite significant for someone whose entire practice is based on photography. So, but what was I going to do with it? Because there's no point. Tech is boring, like in itself. Like the actual technical process, you need to apply it to something, in my opinion. I'm interested in Scottish landscape, and I'm particularly interested in the politics of Scottish landscape, how it's rendered, and yeah, through paintings, through photography. The main thing, though, is that Scotland has one of the most unequal patterns of land ownership in the world. The largest landowner in Scotland is the Danish billionaire Anders Povlsen from ASOS, and he currently owns 220,000 acres of Scottish land. And a lot of that has been bought under carbon credit schemes. And what those do is they allow him to offset the emissions of his fashion business against Scottish land. The downside of this, rather, is that community groups who might want to use this land, who might want to croft it or rewild it in a real sense, are being priced out of the market. A study done by Andy Whiteman and the Scottish Government in 2019 said that half of all privately owned rural land in Scotland is held by just 433 people and companies. Yep. So a big thing for me is that I think the inequality of land ownership in Scotland reflects a global wealth inequality. Oh yeah, auditing. Has anyone come across auditing? Yeah, so auditing is a YouTube phenomena. And it's quite a strange one. And what happens is people go out and they usually go to police stations or military sites or big businesses, and they take cameras, usually with big long lenses and drones, and they film themselves photographing and filming these sites. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get a reaction. They're trying to get a rise out of the people in the building, and they're trying to get them to call the police. And then when the police come, the police don't understand photographic law. They don't understand what people have a right to photograph and what they don't. And then they have these arguments with the police. They make the police look silly. And in a sense, they test the boundaries between the public and the private, and they test the knowledge of these state actors. So it got to a point where it was getting so bad and so many police were being made to look silly that the National Protective Security Authority put out this guidance so that people could read it, and so that when they came across these auditors outside their police stations and their law courts, they wouldn't make themselves look stupid. So that got me thinking about Scottish law. Scotland's a devolved country, so a lot of this is going on in England, and we have devolved laws. And I found out that Scottish land ownership laws, they go back to the Roman times, and what it was, there'd be this column that went right up to the sky and a column that went right down. But then in 1978, there was a case that found that that wasn't actually the case, that in actual fact, the ownership only extends to a height necessary for ordinary use and enjoyment. And that got me thinking about golf. So Scotland's famous sport. I started thinking about how high does a golf ball go? And I found out that it's about 32 yards. It's about the maximum height, which is quite low, I thought. And I started thinking to myself, well, if I was on public land and I had a drone, and I flew my drone over a golf course at a height of 60 meters, then that would be perfectly safe and perfectly legal. And that led me here to the Ayrshire Coastal Path, which is a public right-of-way that runs through Donald Trump's golf course on the west coast of Scotland in Ayrshire. He's also got a course on the northeast coast, Trump International. I spent a lot of time on public beaches, on public roads next to these. And what I started doing was I started using photogrammetry process with drones to scan the land. And so I started trying to make really accurate maps of Donald Trump's land. So here you can see an aerial image of Trump Turnberry. The little purple marker in the top left, that represents me. And the blue line is the path of the drone. So what it does is it flies at a consistent height of 60 meters, crisscrossing over, taking photographs at regular intervals, overlapping. And from these, I'm able to make 3D representations of Donald Trump's land, one-to-one scale. So these little triangles, they represent the position the drone was at, and each one is a photograph over the land. So there you can see a completed model. You can see the Ayrshire Coastal Path, the public right-of-way there in the road. So after many, many weeks in the wind and the rain, I had about 18 of these holes from across Scotland, and I became interested in point clouds. I know Alison just shown some lovely point clouds, and what I liked about them was they looked like photographs. I mean, my background's photography, and yeah, I kind of liked the way they were, but the thing about them is as you zoom in, they lose resolution. You go closer and closer, and they sort of spread out, but they're also really, really accurate. And when you bring them into the software, if anyone's played with 3D software, you can kind of move them around. You can hold them. They're kind of tangible. And I felt like I'd stolen something, more so than when I take a photograph. If I'd taken a photograph of the land, it wouldn't feel the same, or it didn't feel the same to me. I felt like I'd stolen something. W.T.J. Mitchell's come up loads, hasn't he? Yeah. So he said that photography, when digital photography came about, that we experienced like an indexical death. I don't really buy that. And I agree with Jana Seppänen, and she says what really happens in digitization is a qualitative break and material transformation in which a continuous or analog signal is converted to a binary and discontinuous one. However, both signals are physical phenomena inviting no clear distinction between materiality and immateriality. Chris Paulson goes further and talks about indices, analog and digital, having always been signs of indeterminate meaning, in that you need some context, you need people to tell you that this was here and this happened. And I was thinking actually like last night about the Sonderkommando photos, and those photos of Auschwitz, and how on one of them you can't see anything, and you only know that it represents an atrocity by the context and by the narration and by the fact that we are told, and you either accept that or you don't, and you make a leap of faith. And I think for my work, you really do need to make that leap of faith. So they became this project, an experiment in land reclamation. At the time, NFTs were the sort of in vogue. All the tech bros and the financiers were pumping them, and people were saying they were the next big thing. And I was aware of Looty. Looty are a group who go to museums and they 3D scan objects, and then they take them away, mint them on the blockchain and claim ownership of them. And I thought, maybe I could do something like that. That'd be a way to claim ownership of them and maybe redistribute them. I made these fractional NFTs, so I broke them down into millions of pieces, and I thought, everyone could co-own them, and that would be the politics, that it'd be a co-ownership. To be honest, there's just too many technical obstacles to own an NFT to make that accessible. And so I kicked that down the road, and I started thinking about trespass and occupation as a way to claim ownership. So this is an output. This is a 3D model of one of the holes. And I brought it into Unreal Engine, and a few people have spoke about this. And I was like, right, I'm going to make a game. I'm going to make somewhere a multiplayer game where people can come together online and we can all collectively occupy this landscape. And I started collaging. I started buying assets off the Unreal Marketplace. I replaced his lighthouse with a toilet. And yeah, I like to think about my process in making this game in relation to Dada photo montage, in particular the work of Hannah Hock. There's a sort of political element, and it really is a collage. I'm not just relying on what I consider to be a real landscape. On top of that, I'm putting other things. I'm bringing in fake objects. I'm bringing in things that could help me tell a story about that landscape and about Scotland. And just as Benjamin said, I consider the landscape to be that real bloody fingerprint within the work. So I'm going to give you some. I came across this actually after I'd built the game, which is kind of crazy because, yeah, it makes a lot of sense in terms of the game. This was built in Scotland by a company called Traffic Studios. And what it is it's a simulation of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And what you have to do is you have to assassinate Kennedy, but you lose points unless you do it exactly as the official record says. So it says here, the first shot had to miss its target entirely. The second had to pass through Kennedy's neck and strike Texas Governor John Connally in the chest. And the third had to fatally wound the president's head. Any deviation from the official record of events would induce a points penalty. It was obviously, like any game like this, people were really annoyed about it. People got really, really, really upset. But Tracy Fullerton made an interesting point about it. She said simulation carries evidentiary weight, perhaps enough to establish indexical status. Simulations have gone from being seen as suspect and prejudicial to being legally admissible as substantive evidence, providing a probative illustration of actual events. And what she's saying is the accuracy of this in terms of the physics of the bullet, the distance from the point you shoot from and thing, mean that it can be brought into law and classed as indexical, maybe. The other game that's really important to me was this. This is North Sea Oil from 1984, and it was made by a rig worker working offshore in Scotland. And I think it is the very first representation of Scotland in a game, very simply. And it's got what I would call a procedural logic of doom. You can't win. And I think this comes from the oil rig worker and the grimness. If you speak to people who work offshore, they go offshore for like 5 weeks. They make loads of money, they come back on, and it's quite dangerous, it's quite grim, the weather. And I wonder if he had a bigger idea about the oil industry. This was 5 years before the Piper Alpha disaster when the rig went on fire. And what happens is you put your numbers in, you say, oh, this many people, this much fuel, you go out there, and then you come back and you lose. Some text comes up and says, everyone has died, the oil rig's gone on fire, the boat's gone on fire. And I was really interested in this idea of this procedural logic of doom. So I'm going to show you a bit of my game now. This is just a flyover of where it currently stands. So each of these is a hole from Donald Trump's land, and I've set it out in a wind farm. Trump actively campaigned against a wind farm just off the coast of his golf course on the northeast coast. You can see there it's populated by 700 mini AI Donald Trumps, and you can take them out, but they respawn. And the respawn rate is at a rate where it is actually impossible to get rid of them all. They have a really basic AI. Some of them will follow you, some of them won't, some of them just perform silly little tasks. But if you stand still for too long and don't do anything, you'll become overwhelmed by these Trumps to the point where you can't move. So you need to work collectively. The idea of the game would be is that you would get enough people together and you would, because the respawn rate is at a level, if you say had 300 people all working together, you could clear the land of Donald Trump. And I think that's the sort of political message. You can see references to Trident and Polaris. Yeah, I'm working with musicians. They provide me with soundtracks to each of the islands. Yeah, so that's where it stands. I'm going to show you some in-game footage and shut up for a bit and get my breath back. And yeah, this is the game as it currently stands. We got some sound. Oh, there we go.
I'm gonna go.
a tough guy. It doesn't exist, folks. He's going like, I don't remember. Maybe that's what I said.
So yeah, that's it as a work in progress at the moment. There's still quite a lot of work to do on it in terms of making it ready for public release. But if you want to know when it's going to be released, you can get in touch with me via my website. It's going to be released for free. Yeah, you can go and have a go play it. So I'm going to finish with some questions, and these come from an essay by Cindy Peremba, and she's citing Michael Black, an essay on documentary games. And she asked some questions which I think are important for all of us thinking about photography and the virtual and photography and anything we do, really. She said, how do we play the game? Is this the game we want and ought to play? And how can we use simulation to evoke and challenge not only the rules embedded in our psyches by our inherited culture, but even the basic models that generate our presumption that there must be such rules? That's it. I've got one more thing for you. And if you're not convinced by the idea of reclaiming land in the virtual, I've got a free gift for you. And I've taken some land from an unnamed site in the northeast coast of Scotland, about 1 kilogram. And I've put it in little bags, and it's just at the back there. You can help yourself or not. You know, there's a box there. Just help yourself. Might be illegal. Thanks very much.